Welcome to This Week in Heresy, Episode 7, The Multi-Faith Family, with this week's guest, Reverend Beth Parab. Hi, Pastor Beth. Welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Depends on what people want to know, but I can say that I am ordained in the Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm.
So is my dad.
Wow.
So I was raised in the church, grew up in the Diocese of San Joaquin, which until about 8 or 10 years ago still wasn't even ordaining women. And yet I was introduced to other women priests from other dioceses as I was growing up. And I think from about the age of 12, I knew what I wanted to do.
Wow.
So, yeah, I'm the eldest of 4 kids. My youngest brother was born as a bit of a surprise or a miracle. And I grew up in the Central Valley, so, pretty conservative territory. But
right.
After we moved over, my dad took the rectorship of St. John's in Aptos when I was about 21. Within the year of our moving, I was able to realize what my call was. And I think in part it had to do with being in a diocese that ordained women and where that was normal.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking about your sermon this past week when I went to visit St. Jude's, and when you were talking about the women being ordained, and actually how now the Church of England has actually recognized women as bishops, which I think is pretty phenomenal.
They are so excited there. I have a friend in Gloucestershire who is just so over the moon. It's long overdue.
Right.
So it's very exciting.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So the other part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you is because, you know that I'm a multi-faith practitioner, and you are married to a Hindu.
Yes.
And you are raising your children in both traditions.
We are.
And so what led you to that decision when you two got married?
I think it's kind of something that has evolved for us. You bring 2 cultures, 2 religions together, things that very fundamentally make up who you are when there's something you've chosen, like religion. Whatever you really see as foundational to who you are. And so actually, very quickly after Samir and I first met, almost 12 years ago, I went out, and I remember I went into a Barnes & Noble and I got a copy of Hinduism for Dummies because I needed to, or maybe it was The Idiot's Guide to Hinduism, but it was one of those, series, because I was like, I like this guy way too much, and I need to figure out if this is really compatible. And so I began learning about Hinduism. And of course, now the joke with him and his friends is that I know more about Hinduism than he does.
That's awesome.
And so there's, I've gained a great deal of respect, but I think the first thing I had to do was to set aside all of the misinformation that I had been given through various classes and just our Western culture about Hinduism, and came to understand it as something that was very compatible with my own faith. And so it gives me a great deal of joy to share the depth and the breadth of both of our traditions with our daughters. And they love going to church, and they love going to the temple.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Do you run into issues with in either tradition with people? Like they're like, oh, why can't they just be one tradition or the other?
I don't know if it's because people feel like they can't say it to my face, or if they really just aren't having those issues, because nobody has ever said that. it's interesting because I think, well, last year, August, so almost a year ago now, our older daughter, Anushka, decided that she wanted to be baptized. And my husband was really, he just had a lot of trouble with the idea. I think he thought that our daughters would be older before they made a decision, if they were going to make a decision about following one path versus another. And it was hard for him not to feel like Anushka was choosing Christianity over and against Hinduism.
Right.
And so we really had to talk that through. Now, we had only lost his dad maybe 8 months before. And so there was a lot of that sort of, we're living in the United States. We're living in Western culture. You are a priest. I think there was some sense, although I don't think it was all this, but some sense of, will they have any appreciation for their roots as Indians? And so we had to work through that. But, the girls, I don't think that they see one as better than the other because we haven't ever taught them that. And people have been extremely supportive when we talk. I mean, they're more interested than judgmental. But I think that's one of the beauties of the faith that I was raised in. The Episcopal Church is rather syncretistic.
Yeah, yeah.
As is Hinduism.
Right.
And I sort of joke that, if there was a Christian tradition that was going to be broad enough to accept one of their priests being married to a Hindu, it would have to be an Episcopalian or a Congregationalist or, something like that.
But I mean, there is issues too, because I know I've run into it even at City of Refuge, which is a very radically inclusive church. And, but I also believe that, it's what you've learned in the cradle doesn't go away overnight. And you kind of have to meet people where they're at when discussing these multi-faith paths, because, it's, some people don't understand it because it's easier just to kind of focus on one thing, or people are really curious about it. And that's kind of where most people are at this point in time. And I'm wondering, and I don't know if you think this, but I'm wondering if maybe because there's more of the spiritual but not religious, quote unquote, thing going on now, that people are, and the dawn of the internet, that more people are willing to look at finding bits and pieces of other traditions that work for them in order to round out their spiritual path.
It's interesting that you say that, because I have met so many people in the Episcopal congregations that I have served that are also following multiple paths. And so a friend of ours said to Samir, well, you make perfect sense. You're a Ganesh Kapelian. And I thought it was fabulous.
I like that one. I haven't heard that one. I've heard Episcopagan before.
No, I like that. And also, we have several members of our congregation who self-identify as Buddhapelian. And, that to me makes perfect sense.
Right.
So there's, I think you're right. People are looking to, they're less fearful of this. I have a duty to God, country, and church. That way is sort of dying out, I think.
Right.
And where we are is more of a sense of, I need to connect with the divine, with the universe. I need to be a spiritual person. I can't help but do that, but I need to do that on my own terms. And unfortunately, religions have all in their own way, despite the fact that none of them were originally put together to be damaging, are all guilty of it in some way and some time, and some continue to do it. And that's out of a need for conformity, which I think is extremely damaging. So this idea of being able to gather wisdom from multiple traditions, I think my children will be much more spiritually sound than I was. And it took me years to come to where I am currently.
Right.
And I'm still a work in progress, but I believe that I am a better person and more who I'm meant to be because of being partnered with somebody who is so different from who I am.
Well, I think it also makes for, how do I put this? You are able to see, because you're walking in between two paths, you're able to see a much broader picture of the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I find that the Hindu family and friends that we have are so surprised by my dedication to making sure that our daughters appreciate and practice their Hindu faith as well. And that I don't sort of insist that they do it, but not do it myself. I enter into that as well. And one of the things my friend Janet, who's in the Church of England, a priest in the Church of England, pointed out, she said, the unique thing, Beth, is that you don't need to translate what's happening in the Hindu realm into Jesus talk.
Right.
And that, I think, is what kind of puts you into the meta-faith space, is an ability to meet the holy in another language and not need to transliterate it.
Right. It reminds me of, I took an interreligious dialogue class in seminary last fall. And there was one particular scholar, and I can't remember his name right now, but he was talking about how there's a different language each religion has. And even if they're, it's English speaking, it has their own set of terminologies and practices. And now, well, he was saying, this particular scholar was saying that, that the languages are separate entities and don't overlap. My ideas with, when I talk about metafaith, is that there are some areas that do overlap.
Yes.
There's a lot of ideas that do overlap, but, and this is how I came to terms with my own dual faith, is that there are some areas that don't overlap, and that's okay.
Yes. And what's more, very often we poach one another's language.
Absolutely.
And when we do that, the rewriting of the meaning of something causes a great deal of at least misunderstanding and at most a great deal of hurt, and it drives a wedge between people, I think. And I certainly saw that in having discussions with people about Wicca. When we had our unit on that in in comparative world religions at our youth group, we were talking. Our presenter was one of our youth mentors who formerly was a member of a coven and who was practicing as a witch. And she spent the first half of our time together defining her terms.
Right.
And what she was really doing was reclaiming the language from Hollywood and from, all sorts of stuff, different venues, but mostly media that have co-opted the language of paganism and made it largely pejorative. And there's something so sad in that when we use, when we are, I don't know if everyone necessarily intends to do so sort of without thought, but very often we will take another's language and misuse it. And it just gets very sad to me.
Yeah. And I know I've had to keep, running dictionaries in my head. That's what I like to call it with some people, because, or recognizing like after talking with somebody and talking about a certain thing, like, oh, wait a minute, they don't understand the term in the same way that I understand the term.
Yes.
Okay, let's take a step back and define terms.
We had this issue, Samir and I, it wasn't between the two of us because I'd done enough study about Hinduism at that point, but he was talking about the gods of Hinduism and about the idols on the altar that we have at home. And I said, you're probably not aware of this, but when you talk about multiple gods and when you talk about idols, to ears that have been fashioned by an understanding that's been fashioned by a Judeo-Christian mentality, what you get is, idol worship, and everybody freaks out.
Right.
And then they start screaming words of refute, like pagan, So it's like, well, and what's funny about that is then they've just gone back to the person who was talking about idols and gods.
Right.
So it sort of perpetuates. And I understand that we are products of our own upbringing. It really is our responsibility to learn the terms of the language that, if I go visit in India, then I do need to learn the customs and I do need to learn what's polite and what's impolite.
Yeah.
Not only for my own well-being, but because I don't wish to cause offense.
Yeah. I know for my own students and, the people that I teach, I try to make sure, listen, if you are going to somebody else's space, have a buddy, have somebody that can help you navigate. And and I made the mistake of not doing that. I was taking my global religions class, which is one of my final classes, and I went to a Sheikh temple, and I went to the one in San Jose, which is like the biggest one outside of India.
And the Gurdwara there is
the Gurdwara
huge.
is
Yes.
enormous.
Yes.
And it's beautiful and it's gorgeous and the food was amazing. However, I felt so out of place, and I randomly asked this woman to walk me through, and she kind of did the speed pray with me. And I realized, when exploring other people's religions, I had done a lot of reading about Sikhism, Sikh temple.
Yes.
Sikhism and everything. But it would have been better if I had found a buddy to go with who could be like, okay, this is what you do now. This is why you're doing it. And, and I made the mistake of not doing that. And I felt really out of place.
Live and learn.
And it was kind of like, all right, yeah, I'm the big white girl going in the wrong place at the wrong time. So
it's an interesting thing, though, to be the odd one out. Visiting in India, going to the Sunnyvale Temple where our family worships. It's very interesting to be the one that everybody stares at, that everybody's interested in. And I actually look forward to it. And I look forward to it for my daughters because I think that there is so much to be gained from the experience of the other. It makes you more compassionate. It makes you thoughtful of the way you behave. And for instance, staring is not considered rude in the Indian culture.
Yeah.
And so I will just get, and I'm like, is it because I'm white? Is it because of my surgical scars? Is it because, what? I don't know. And it's all okay with me. It's just, I think it's an experience that everybody should have of being the other and not just once. Yeah.
I absolutely agree because you don't understand. I think you don't understand the other until you've experienced an othering in that way. And I know I've got that in spades on different ways, and so I'm really grateful for those experiences. But I also think, being able to sit down and listen to the stories too.
Yes.
Because you don't really know people until you hear their stories.
That's absolutely true.
And, I've done some of the activism work that I've done, was sitting down and letting people hear the other person's stories.
Yes. Yes.
Just to find some compassion and common ground somewhere.
That has been entirely my experience as a woman in the priesthood. That I've served in more conservative parishes where, and I mean that in the broadest sense possible. Not so conservative that they wouldn't have had a woman priest, obviously, but it was interesting. There were people from older generations, probably my grandparents' generation, who told me, multiple people at different times, who basically said to me, I never have been in favor of women priests.
Really?
But I like you.
Wow, interesting.
And I have always believed that it is the relationship, it's the contextual experience of that group, or that, I don't know, whatever it is, you have to have an experience of relating to someone who you wouldn't otherwise approve of or interact with, before those barriers get broken down, because then you see them as more than whatever it is that you disapprove of or are afraid of. You see them as a whole person.
Right.
And that changes minds.
Right.
You can't just scream at somebody with a signpost on a corner and get them to change their mind. That's just going to reinforce it, in my opinion. I think minds are changed across coffee tables.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know that's part of my own ministry too, because, I come as when I approach people or I'm doing my ministry, I come as my whole self.
Yes.
I think it's disingenuous to not be my whole self when I'm doing my ministry work.
Yeah.
And, and it's a very strange place to be, because there's so much that, it's hard enough as a priest to have privacy, good privacy. And I know that very well.
Yep. It's a little bit of a fishbowl.
Right, exactly. And to be a priest that is a multi-faith priest is pretty hard too, because you also got, well, I don't know about your other tradition. Teach me. And then, trying to be open and honest about everything, and then people freaking out on you.
Yeah, well, and that is the biggest risk in any relationship, is that if you bring your whole self, you'll be rejected. I see that example in Jesus. I see that example in bringing one's whole self and being willing to face whatever happened, whether people would care to listen or not listen, or whether they would try to take his life, and so many other people, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, these are people who I hold in very high esteem, because they put their whole selves into what they believed, and were willing to, risk that rejection. I think it is one of the more profound abilities in the heroes of the world. I think that they're willing to take that risk, because we all have to admit that we really do care about being loved. We do want to be respected. We do want to be seen for who we are in our entirety, and not to be told that we're less than. It's the most human need we have,
and it's hard. I know I can only speak for myself, but I know it's a difficult thing. And, there are some days where I'm just like, okay, I've just had enough, and I don't want to read another Facebook post about how Christians suck or how Wiccans suck.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and unfortunately, Christianity and paganism get horrible press all the time because of misunderstanding.
Yep.
And because of the damage done by those who were using their status in that practice to abuse others. And just none of us are exempt. You know, I've had people ask me, how can you be a Christian when, you know, the Crusades, the, you know, the KKK, but I'm like, you know, as far as I can tell, Jesus didn't ask anybody to do any of that stuff. You know, I personally think that Jesus would be pretty appalled by, is pretty appalled by a lot of things that are done in his name. You know, I don't think that he was about any of the things that have caused harm. And I don't think any of the world's religions were established for the sake of harm. But there's only one there's only one humanity. And unfortunately, you know, the only perfect church is the church without any people in it. You know? You can say that about covens too, right? So there's that's just the way it is. So you know, how it rolls. I think one of the best explanations for, you know, churches being filled with people who are hypocrites and, you know, pedophiles and everything else is, you know, the church is a hospital for sinners. Faith groups are places where we hope we're planting seeds for goodness, for kindness, for compassion and growth and all those things. And I really do believe that about all of the religions of the world, that's what they were meant for. Whether or not we use them for those things is entirely up to us.
Yeah, and I think another thing, and that just what you just said made me think about, is how people kind of think that they have to stick with one thing for the rest of their lives. That's who they are. You know, they are Christian, they are pagan, they are this, that, the other. And for some people, that's fine, and it works for them, and that's great. But, you know, people seem to get really stuck on the idea that you can't switch or you can't move to different things when you need to.
And they are told. People are largely told. I know that that the path that they were raised in is the only true path. And I think that actually does a lot of psychological damage, because when you come to the point of spiritual questioning, of you know, Richard Rohr calls it falling upward. When you come into a more adult state of spirituality, if you have nowhere else to go, then you're doomed. And there are people who just are absolutely convinced of that. You know, I know that it is not across the board true for every Roman Catholic church, for every Latter-day Saint church, but I know that it is largely a part of their makeup, very much for a lot of the conservative Christian denominations. People are told that there is one way. Ultimately, that if you do not follow this way, if you should ever fall away, as they say, then you're destined for eternal damnation. What kind of psychological and emotional damage is being done by that, instead of saying, I honor all paths. This is my path, and I respect the path that you're on. It's very much that concept of namaste, which I was introduced to through my husband's Hinduism. And I, you know, I no longer look at my Christian faith as the way exclusively, but I was raised in a culture that believed that had respect for people on another path, but the quiet hope is that they would discover that the Christianity was the better path.
Right.
I no longer am in that belief, in that mindset, but I know that I worship with people who do believe that. I know that for millions of Christians, that is the belief, and they will cite scripture to tell you that's why it's true.
Right.
But I think their God is too small.
Yeah. I agree. I think especially in this day and age. I mean, we're in the 21st century. We have the internet that can tell us about all sorts of different things and has exposed people to a much bigger universe, basically. And to me, it seems kind of strange to think that God has to be that small.
Well, even historically, the religions of the world were not out to convert one another.
Right.
Thousands of years ago.
Right.
It was only with the dawn of monotheism, which even was not present in early Israel. But monotheism, as it developed, became an exclusive way that began to be very imperialistic, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But that was not always the case.
Right.
There was so much more. Your religion is much more a part of your cultural identity, much more based on the region of the world you were living in. There wasn't such a need to, save people from their error.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I know in seminary, I had a real fondness for studying early Christian stuff, especially Gnosticism, but also just
all those great heresies.
Yeah, well, this is This Week in Heresy.
There you go.
But the other thing that really got me about the early Christian practices was how similar they were to a lot of the neo-pagan practices, and to some degree, in the fact that it was initiatory.
Yes.
Your baptism was an initiatory practice.
Yes.
And when I did my liturgy for the church, I made that distinction because, I think there's been some things that have been lost.
Yes.
And a lot of the mysticism that is present in Christianity, in the early years of Christianity, has been lost, and especially, at least in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but in the Protestant movement, it lost a lot of the mysticism, and I think people are really craving that now. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Episcopal Church is still doing fairly well, for the most part. For the most part, I mean,
we're still breathing.
Yeah, but there's still that mysticism that's allowed.
Absolutely. I think, right now, the book group that I lead is reading Karen Armstrong's A History of God. And she talks about the way in which the early church was not so concerned with historical fact. With reporting things as you would expect from your nightly news report. That they were much more concerned with the mystical and spiritual ideals of God, and that down through the centuries, you can watch how our idea of God or the Holy One changes and evolves according to the needs of society at the time. And I think that we're seeing another change right now in this this new sort of horizon of meta faith, of being able to explore the wisdom from multiple traditions instead of having to sign on for one and forsake all others as heresy or invalid, but that there is really this ability to grow from multiple traditions.
Yeah, and I find that really fascinating because the early Christian movement was in a kind of the same type of time period that we're experiencing now. And instead of physical trade, now it's information trade with the internet. And I think that's a really fascinating parallel to really be like, wow, this isn't new. This is just the next evolution of the same ideas and happenings.
You might have even called the early Christians metafaith as well.
Yeah.
They were Jewish, and yet they were interpreting things to such a new degree because of who Jesus was and who they were coming to understand him even after his death as being, and of course, we've watched that evolve.
Right.
So this understanding of who he was and, well, who did he really think he was? That's another conversation. But it's really interesting to see how they were bringing together ideas from the Greco-Roman world and the pantheon of gods there. And St. Paul, in his travels, bringing in all of that understanding and really interpreting Christianity for the Gentiles, as they were called. And then to have traditional Judaism, Messianic Judaism, and then this arrival, throw Jesus into the mix, stir, and see what you get.
Boom.
This is, it seems to me most likely that Jesus wasn't really about the business of starting a new religion.
Yeah.
But look what happened. And I'm not sure if he would be pleased with that or if he was just like, no, guys, I was really just, trying to reform the existing thing. Whatever that was about. When you look at the history of it, it makes me chuckle because I think, we're just doing the same thing now. And, a new way.
In my Wiccan tradition, we say things go in cycles, and there's the wheel of the year and all that. And I think humanity is going through another cycle of this type of intellectual growth and exchange of ideas and all that.
Yeah. Well, I believe it's Carolyn Mace who writes and speaks about the cycles of energy through time, and she has said that they go in about, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 400 or 500 year cycles, and that we're coming into one now. In terms of major changes in the spirituality of people overall. And so this identifying as nuns, N-O-N-E, when, or in spiritual but not religious, all of this, even the conversation that I think is still fairly alien to a lot of Christians, which is this idea of metafaith or multi-faith identity. This is all part of that.
Yeah, I think so too, and it's been interesting to see this evolution occur, and just like seeing it unfold right before your eyes, and then being a part of it.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, it's my dream that at some point, whether I create it or someone else does, that there is the possibility to have a community where my children are not the only ones who have multiple faith identity.
Right.
And where people who have experienced pain because of the religion that they were raised in to be able to come into safe space, where people are able to have access to the wisdom of multiple faith traditions and explore without having to sign on to a single one. And I dearly want that, not just for myself, but for my children. I want them not to sort of say, well, I don't know anybody else like me. I have yet to meet another family with young children who are raising their children in both. I know plenty of families who chose one over the other. But that comes out of the reigning wisdom that has said, you'll confuse them. And so they either said, mistakenly, I think, and it's just my opinion, but, that, well, then you have to choose nothing.
Right.
And they'll choose later. Well, if you don't give children, it's like saying, maybe, I speak English, he speaks Marathi. We won't speak anything to them. We'll let them choose their language later. No, you have to give a foundation. So.
Yeah. And, but also, like, my mom also was like that. She raised me in the Catholic Church for the first few years of my life, for several years of my life. And then, when it came time to do confirmation, she gave me the choice whether to do it or not. And I think, but it was always that openness about that. Like, you're not stuck here.
Yes. And that's a real gift. That's a real gift.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, many people don't see it that way, you know, and I think that's, well, can I say that it makes me sad? I shouldn't say it's sad. That sounds really judgmental, but it makes me sad when people feel like, well, if this no longer works for me, but nothing else comes close, then I'm adrift, and I hate that. I hate that. So I really am hopeful. You know, there are 3 centers for dual faith belonging that exist in the U.S. And in the fall, I'm hoping to visit the one in D.C. All 3 are Jewish Christian, but they've been very successful.
I know that we've talked about this before, and you know we're doing some little discussions behind the scenes.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think it's a fantastic idea because, especially in areas like where we are in Silicon Valley, where there's just so many multi-faith families, multicultural families, people who are choosing other religions other than just the big 3. It's a need, and I think there's a need for people to have that.
Right, and I think that there's also so much of the population who really never was anything. Their parents didn't raise them in anything. They have no tradition. They have nothing that they would necessarily automatically go to, but they feel this draw, this, you know, spiritual yearning. But to just go into one might feel really overwhelming. But what if we had a center that allowed you to explore, not in the sense of, you know, going to a supermarket and have so many different choices that, you know, you don't really make much of any of them, but to have a place where it's safe to explore and nobody is expecting you to convert in that traditional sense.
And you can meet clergy and talk to them, and they're not going to be like, well, you have to come to my church, or you have to do this, you have to do that.
Right. I think it takes the fear out of it. It takes the kind of, you know.
Yeah. I mean, and I know I try to do that in my own ministry, just as my own church and everything. But to be able to have colleagues in one space that also do that. I mean, as just as a clergy person working as a clergy person would be fantastic.
Well, children and adults have the same fear of, you know, I know, you know, if you're starting at a new school and you have to walk onto campus that first day, it doesn't matter how great the kids are going to be once you get there. You're still afraid to walk onto the campus. So I know a lot of Christian churches talk about how welcoming they are because the people are friendly and because we have good signage to tell you where the restrooms are and, you know, all that stuff. You know, we're here and we're happy and we're really nice
we
people.
Have a rainbow flag.
Why won't they come? And, maybe we've got a rainbow flag and, you know, like, wow, we're so welcoming. And the problem is that people are afraid just to come onto campus. They don't know if they're going to get ambushed. They don't know if you're going to be, you know, if they're going to come in and you've said on your website that you were welcoming and they sit down and they hear a sermon, you know, that's really hateful. I mean, they don't know what they're in for until they actually get there. And if they don't have a friend to come with them or something like that, it can be very overwhelming. And I think that as people who are already insiders, we often forget that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We do. I mean, we don't think about whether we're handicapped accessible until the government legislates that we have to be handicapped accessible. And we don't think about whether, you know, all of our social events involve food. And very often, not terribly healthy food. Thank you very much. And, you know, what about, do we offer an alternative for people who are friends of Bill Wilson and cannot receive the wine at the sacrament? You know, are we clear about the alternative? Because these are obstacles for people. And I think sometimes, unless it's a problem for us personally, we don't make the effort to go out and learn about it, become acquainted with it, and to ask, not assume, how we can be more welcoming.
Yeah. And I know I've talked with several other guests about the same kind of stuff. Especially one of my things is body size activism, and how do we address health in a congregation, and there's just so much language around that and around disability and around just faith alone that could turn people away and drive people away. And I think, we as clergy people have a responsibility to make sure that we are at least aware and try, we're human. We're going to make mistakes, of course, but to at least be aware and try and do as the best we can.
Yes. And then to assume that people are doing the best they can. Sometimes as a priest, I have caught myself being judgmental of other people where they are in their faith journey.
Right.
And not just of people who, are in a different faith. I'm actually I'm much more tolerant of that than of people in my own faith tradition who I might see as like, oh, yeah, I used to think that, but then I grew up. And I'm like, oh, wait, that's not fair.
I totally understand that.
Like I've got the corner on the market of good theology, and just a willingness to assume that we're all doing the best we can with what we have and what we were given, what we've been given permission to shed, those harmful things that we were taught before. Giving people the benefit of the doubt sometimes is one of the hardest things.
Oh yeah,
and yet one of the most graceful gifts that we can give. And and yet, Christian culture just has a history of telling people why they're wrong. And burning you at the stake if you don't repent.
Right.
So, it to me, there's something very humbling about being able to say, yes, I do that. And I'm really trying not to more and more. There are things about my Christian faith that make me a better person. And there are things about our Christian history that that make me shudder.
Yeah.
And to be a priest in that tradition means that sometimes I need to apologize.
Absolutely.
Not because I did it, but because people need to hear it. Because it's a healing thing to say, you know what? That's not what I'm about. Yeah. But as you said earlier, that only happens in relationship.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen when we, get noisy and obnoxious on a street corner and tell people they're going to hell.
Right. Exactly.
Ooh, way to bring somebody in.
Yeah.
It always kind of makes me cringe. I think, who do you think is going to warm up to that?
Right.
Yeah. Where's the gospel? Where's the good news in that?
Yeah. Where's the love of Jesus in that?
Yeah.
So.
Oh, well.
Well, I know we can talk for a long, long time, but we are out of time.
Okay.
So if people would like to get in touch with you to talk more about these issues, what is the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, probably to go online to stjudes.org, that's spelling out the word saint, or to email me at bethparab@gmail.com.
All right. Well, we'll put that all in the show notes and have the links there. And thank you very much for being on This Week in Heresy.
Absolutely a pleasure.
And hopefully we can have you back.
I would love it.
All right.
I would love it.
Thanks a bunch. I'd like to thank Pastor Beth for joining us this week. And as always, if you have comments, questions, or want to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com, where you can also subscribe to this podcast via iTunes or the Stitcher app. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.